So yeah, my name's Annie. I graduated from Hereford about 3 years ago, and I've been, amongst other things, an artist in residence at Birmingham School of Jewellery for about 2 years now. What I want to talk to you about today is we might choose to make work that's about the body, include the body in life, body in death, in metal, what that does, and what specific perspectives metal and metalworking might bring into that conversation that perhaps other materials don't quite meet. So I've got this all written out here because there's no way I'd stay on track otherwise. So bear with me for a little while. So we all talk about metal's secret properties, its softness and squishiness, and the agency that it has that means we never quite have or even want full control over what it does. Many of us describe the process of working metal, whether through forging or raising or any similar process of substantial material movement, as a dialogue with the material, where both parties have some level of influence over the form and meaning of a piece of work. Sorry, I've lost my ability to scroll on here. Give me 2 seconds. So as a dialogue with the material, where both parties have some level of influence over the form and meaning of a piece of work. As artists and metalsmiths, we have access to the unique perspective of a material that talks back, this vibrant, unruly medium that asserts its opinion and responds with a deep, substantial presence to what we as artists ask of it. This is what makes me want to pick up a hammer again and again, and I think it's the central characteristic of our medium that defines its position in art and craft discourse. So we all understand that we are in conversation with our material. What I'm really interested in, however, is what we're talking to the metal about. We're essentially able to access metal's point of view into the work that we make. And I think our job is to figure out how we go about bringing subjects and objects into that site of conversation and pose them as questions to the metal. Now, there are infinite subjects to approach metal with, and I'm sure that there are loads of ways of doing that, even within the body. But I think this specific field, metal is particularly valuable to, because of these kind of living, active characteristics that it has as a material. So I was already interested in making body art well before I got into blacksmithing. And the reason I went down this route into metal is because the moment I hit some, I felt something muscular and living and bodily in the material that I'd never felt before. And I think that's the squish and the personality that we all talk about when we work the metal. And I'm so sure that it has something vital to say about the body. It's taken me a long time to even begin to articulate why I think that matters, but I'm hoping that today I can begin to tease out how this active, sensitive reactivity that metal has gives it a kind of material flesh that might act as a proxy for the human body. And I think that unlocking this ability through metalwork to access the body as material with agency, rather than either reducing it to brute matter or pure concept alone, could have some really exciting implications for the discourse in art around gender and the body, and possibly also around death. By seeing metal as its own substantive material body and beginning to consciously work with it in this context, I believe that we have the opportunity to develop an artistic language through which we can similarly engage with our own bodies as material that can be moved, altered, and impressed upon, but at the same time that its senses respond and pushes back, so it doesn't lose that kind of life force that it has within that material. So I'll talk more about how that works and why I think it matters, but I want to provide some context for these ideas and how they've developed through my work with the material. Throughout the talk, I've also tried to relate everything I'm saying back to some recognizable characteristic of material, so that hopefully, even if you're not familiar with the kind of context that I'm speaking in, you'll still be able to relate as metal workers or as craftspeople to the sensations and the solid presence of those ideas in material. And hopefully you'll begin to make some of these tacit connections between metal and the human body. That's what I really want to demonstrate through this talk and through my research. So as with everything in blacksmithing, these ideas come about with conversation with the material. So getting to know metal and really just trying to figure out what it is that feels so human about it is what's led me to see it as possessing its own responsive body. From the very beginning of making this work, I was drawn to these fleshy, tendon forms that appear naturally along the corners of forged steel. When you push a fuller into the metal, it generates a pinch point and a squish in opposite directions. And you can overlap and follow these forms to create aesthetically a kind of rhythm and movement in the facets. At the same time, though, as you're working with this aesthetically, you can also feel that motion and rhythm and the density of this muscular material as you work. That fluidity and response isn't just visual, it's material. And you can feel a substantial input from the metal that determines the form when you work with it in this way. So I started trying to use those facets to depict the human body. In this project, I wanted to see how you could form a human out of this fleshiness that metal had, and get an idea of how metal would describe a person if you asked it to. So that's what this series of figurines is, following those naturally generated forms of forging and trying to tease out a figure from those overlapping hammer blows and fuller marks. For me, though, the really important, successful part of this piece is these small areas of really dense movement in the material. So in these areas that represent under the arms or the rib cage, at these joints in the body where a lot of muscle and bone interact, there are these folds and twists. The metal just expresses really naturally. And these details, what I think best demonstrates the substance of the human body in the metal, the way the metal's best able to show that, and also the way you see the most of how expressive that squash of the metal can be. Now, when making art that's concerned with the body, I keep finding myself up against a wall of representation, which I think is something we all kind of fall into as creatives and as craftspeople sometimes, where you feel like you're illustrating something. And with the body in particular, we assign so much meaning to the image of a person that to make an artwork that looks like a body, it immediately directs the viewer to assign some kind of identity to that image. We want to know who they are, what they're doing, and what their body means, and not necessarily what it's made up of as a material. So because of this, I was becoming increasingly frustrated at how human my work looked, because these were the parts that I was really interested in. After making a few different sets of these figurines in different scales and in different types of metal, I'd reached this point where I was starting to be able to depict really complex human forms with this kind of sinewy, faceted structure that came from the metal. I was never adding heads or faces because I knew even at this point that I was trying really hard not to make portraits, and I wanted the work to be about the body and not about a person. But I'd started adding separate limbs and creating these poses. And there's still that same structure of the facets and sinew as in the previous work, but the more emotive and expressive these figures became, the more I thought they were telling a kind of story about a person. The more complex silhouettes began to distract from the rhythm and movement of the metal that's what I was really drawn to, and from the humanity of the material, and therefore from the materiality of the human. So these surface layers of narrative and identity are representational. They illustrate and tell stories about our bodies and how they interact with the world around them. But at the same time, they obscure their physicality and the visceral substance that makes them up. We're looking at people, looking at bodies, but not necessarily engaging in what it is to be a body. I'm trying to figure out what happens when you begin to handle the substantive material of the body, how you can reach beyond and beneath its surface aesthetic and examine not what a body shows, but what it does and how it feels. So this is a problem not just in metalsmithing. It's posed throughout a lot of contemporary art conversation about the body. In her critique of feminist art about the body, for example, Lauren Elkin observes that we're limited by a purely intellectual reading of art, and without an ability to engage empathetically, she says we remain impoverished in our understanding of the politics of a body. There's something that we're missing if we're only thinking about the body and not feeling or moving or messing around in it. The body in figurative representative art, like this, remains a metaphor. And Elkin, like many of the artists she cites, doesn't really feel like this goes enough. She's searching for ways to express how it feels to be a body. She talks throughout this book that I'm citing about art and about art trying to return touch to the aesthetic. And often she finds this touch most immediately present in art which somehow overflows itself. The examples she gives are generally of work with meaning or history too expansive to hold within itself, of art that's emotionally or physically arresting because it's shocking or grotesque. or in contrast, art which is warm and inviting and domestic and draws the viewer in. So, which I think is quite similar to a lot of these memorial pieces that we've been looking at over the last couple of days. It's got that kind of reaching out and grabbing you as a viewer, which definitely kind of accesses that sensory component of this grief. But with works like this, I think they still tend to be representational and don't necessarily quite reach out in that same way. They contain and express a powerful impression that the artists are searching for a way of speaking honestly about the experience of body and of reaching, groping outwards to find it. But I think maybe there's only so much you can do when you're showing these desires, sensations, and bodies. We find it quite easy to tell honest and impactful stories about overflowing. But what if we could go further with a material that overflows its state as base matter? What becomes possible if we work with a substance that does not just show the human form, but feels like the body does? Steel has this internal overflowing character. As the metal's heated and wrought, the matter of it slowly falls away, layer after layer, in scale. It slowly reveals the inner core of the material, but at the same time, it reveals that that inner core is no different from the material being lost. The form is constantly, simultaneously uncovered and also obscured. And that's a characteristic that's built into that material and not something that we're applying theoretically or metaphorically onto it. So there are other bodily perspectives in art, ones that use these materials that feel to us like flesh, that in some ways do access that sensory, that feel that we're looking for. So materials like fat, rubber, fabric, and food that decay or droop or look and feel like parts of the body. These, I think, fill in other parts of that full picture that we're searching for, the full impression and expression of what it is to be a body. But I think there's another perspective, another gap to fill that these sensory artworks don't touch, but that metal can. That is how something can feel from the point of view of the material. Something that exists like the body does and has something to say while remaining pliable matter. So not just these materials that we are able to experience as being fleshy or having something that feels like the body, but something that responds like the body, something that from that perspective feels like how we feel things. So Elkin assigns significance to the presence of the maker in a piece of work, as we also often do, seeing in the marks and manufacture and the evidence of the maker's hand an insight into what it was like to make the work, how it felt and how the artist thought through that material, how maybe that process of working changed the conclusion, changed how they felt about their subject. In the cheeks, the creases, the swell and the squish of metal, however, I think we have a second record of that experience, an impression of what it was like for the material to make that work, how it was to be that material and how it was able to think through us in the same time that we think through it. So, as we all talk about all of the time, we're always locked in a conversation with metal about what it is like to be metal. I'm suggesting that we can turn that perspective around, recognise that we've been speaking to metal about a type of body this whole time, and then consciously use that realisation to begin to ask it questions about our bodies too. So Lauren Elkin, in that book, she's searching for an overflowing excessive flesh, where the organisation of the body is lost and transgresses a boundary into becoming moving, sensing material. I believe that metal passes towards us in the other direction, an inorganic material escaping itself into a moving, sensing body. And I think we just must be able to use this passing interaction, this collision of flesh and metal and sense and point of view, to dig deeper into what it means to be a material body, whether that's coming from the material body of the metal or from our material bodies. So as I said at the beginning, metal's ability to provide a material's perspective is one of its defining characteristics as a medium. It's how we're able to dialogue with it in our work. To go a little further, I believe that the reason this perspective is so valuable to body art in particular is that this perspective understands to an extent not only what it feels like to be material, but also to be flesh. Returning to those creases and folds in the body that the forms of forging express so naturally, I hope you can see that they're evidence of motion, of an underlying twist, tension, or musculature within the substance of that human form. But I believe that the folding of skin or the squash of a muscle under tension holds that same evidence of reaction and interaction that the folds and squash of metal hold as it's wrought. I think the importance of these forms isn't so much that they look human, but that they are formed in both flesh and metal through the same active responsiveness that those two materials have in common. The same facets and dimples and squash are generated by the same pressure and resistance that comes from both inside and outside of the material or body. The same creases and folds form when metal and skin crumple under the tension and compression of the forces that run through them. So, to bring it back to the metal for a minute, I'm in love with the texture of copper at the moment that it's pulled from an acid pickle, for how it mimics and facilitates this empathetic familiarity between flesh and metal. Stripped raw and pitted, at this moment it is the sore exposed colour of skin that's been burned or scraped back, the open subdermis. Copper quickly forms a protective oxide layer when exposed to the air, but for now it's briefly open, and the human and copper skins are momentarily in contact with each other without a barrier of any kind. And if you pick up these vessels as they come out of that pickle, at that point of active handling, the copper's microscopically rough, and it feels remarkably like the velvet of skin. And if the object has large round forms, creases, ripples, divots for the thumb to fall into, and high bony peaks, then that handling feels roughly the same as moving the hand across a knee, elbow, or shoulder, and finding that same density of interaction there between muscle and skin and bone that you see in that tension as it runs across the copper. And it's at this point of being most open and active that the metal becomes the most human, not just for how it feels to touch, but also because the structure of that copper skin is formed through compressive tension and spreading in the exact same way that human skin is pushed and pulled across the force of muscle and organ beneath it. If you vanish and harden the material in two opposite directions, like in raising or chasing, the soft area between those two hardened areas puffs out and it softly crinkles like flesh in a joint, like the pad of your hand when you open and close your fingers. That material is formed as flesh, and when it's exposed or when its cell-like grain structure expands and contracts, it also interacts with the world and responds as if a body. So this rhythmic breathing, this rhythmic breath of the opening and closing aperture, that kind of availability to the world around it, is what Gilles Deleuze saw as exposing the figure beyond and beneath the body. Just like Elkin, he was searching for an internal sensing body that was neither a representative illustration nor a conceptual abstraction, but this kind of disordered, constantly emotion presence of the body inside itself, this kind of indescribable life or feeling or immanence that's just there. And Deleuze saw this figure as the transitory interaction between sensation and the body, something that creates and is also created by this interaction between the body and its surroundings, subject and object, matter and sense, and body made real through a collision. Essentially, it's the material of the moment when a body feels something. So for Deleuze, he found this figure underneath everything as a kind of writhing vibrational potential that's absolutely concretely physical, but also constantly varying and defining and redefining itself in relation to everything it comes into contact with. In art, he believed that Francis Bacon was most able to reveal this figure. He saw the painter's work as a frozen in time glimpse of that moment of the crawling, squirming motion that he saw as being present behind the body, within the body. In Bacon's work, he saw an expansion and contraction of bodies within their environments, and in the breathing and pulsing, opening and closing of those bodies and their different solid organs. This bodily rhythm constantly allowing the passage of sensation through the figure and condensed into forms in these paintings. The oil-slick colours of the skin that marble through each other reveal the flickering of an object through time or from different angles, and these bright, cool, dark blood tones appeal to the senses and the emotions through the eyes. But according to Deleuze, they were also able to bypass conscious interpretation and speak directly to the viewer's body through their nervous system. I think this is the same felt experience that Elkin searches for when she looks at this feminist art and is trying to find a way of feeling body and feeling in art. So it's the same kind of affective turn. But so here, through the internal motion and churning collisions of the figure, it's uncovered as some core intuitive presence that's always there, but also just always on the brink of existing. So this breathing vibrational presence, it's kind of difficult to express in those words, and it often feels a little bit word soupy. And it might be visually or metaphorically revealed within an inert material or an artwork, like a painting or something. But again, I think we're all familiar with how it's expressed in metal, that you can just feel this immanence in the swelling readiness of hot steel, its capacity and muscular give overflowing to its form. Through that tacit sense of potential and buzzing presence, you can feel the proximity of the figure in forge work. So if you weren't quite following when I was talking through Deleuze's theories, I think if you kind of think for a moment about the way that metal expresses itself, maybe seeing it through that lens, you start to understand how that kind of indescribable bodily presence reveals itself. So we have inherently this rhythmic opening and closing, expansion and contraction, not just through the grain structure, but also the cyclical heating and cooling of the material. Forces that transfer back and forth between hammer and steel during forging create these interactions and responses that are then solidified into the active, but constantly generated substance of its forms. All of this is solid, it is all material, but it's also temporary and transitional, as the steel's always immanent and always available for working and reworking. It isn't like clay that once it's fired, it's finished and can only be used in something like mosaics. Every single thing that we have that's forged is immediately available to be melted down again or picked up, heated and hit with a hammer in any other form. It has, even when it's a final solid object, it has this potentiality built into it as a material. And if we want to understand something intuitive and physical like this, rather than appealing to an emotional response through aesthetics or revealing a vibrant, substantial body, perhaps we could also generate and crawl around inside a material that contains and expresses its own immanent body. Whether that presence is ever revealed or remains obscured within that kind of working of the material, we would still be able to access and engage with it when we see it as a substantial, inherent part of that substance. So, what Elkin and Deleuze have in common is that they are searching for the substance below the surface of the body. Crucially, not because they believe there is a core, immovable truth of the body to be found there, something that you can uncover and find as this kind of soul or central component that makes it what it means to be a human, but rather because we're limited in the art that we make and the ways that we can understand a body until we figure out a way to examine and manipulate and engage with the full depth of the body as material, rather than as just concept or narrative. In body art now, I am seeing more and more fragmentation. The movement is towards deconstructing the human body into material that's beyond or beneath identity, that can be changed and that can open up to the substance of the world that it interacts with. The problem with, or the thing that I think is missing in a lot of this art that I see, is that we're deconstructing the body into this kind of base material that can then be built up into something else. But that material feels a little inactive. And I think when we deconstruct the body, it's important to see that kind of moment of deconstruction before it's built back up again as this moment of potential where you have this fluid, mutable substance and play around with it in that moment, rather than trying to reduce something, strip everything within it that makes it a material, that makes it a person, and then try and build back up again from nothing. So I think what metal does is it's matter that's taken apart into raw substance, but it's still able to respond and feel. It never quite loses that immanence, that presence, and that potentiality that we're looking for in this deconstruction of the body, that doesn't just deconstruct it to nothing. If the next step in body art discourse is to find a way to access the vital substance of the body as a living volume rather than a surface or abstract idea, then I think it stands to reason that that step could emanate from a medium that's deeply engaged with volume and that expresses an internal thumping presence that can respond and exudes this potential for dialogue and transformation. I believe that forging, raising, and manipulating metal generates a substantial material perspective from which our art could approach and begin to deconstruct the limits of the body and its potential as we understand it. In other words, by engaging in this physical dialogue, metal gains a sort of proxy body that reflects and responds to its environment. And at the same time, we move in the opposite direction to become more material, more immanent, and more workable. Once we've found and created this material body outside of the body, the problem then becomes what to do with it. What potentials do we open up in our understanding of our bodies if we're able to access them as a material outside of the self? And I think this is the point I found myself at now, where I'm just beginning to be able to hold a conversation with metal about our respective bodies. And the work from here is to dig into that passing point between material on its way to body and body on its way to material and crawl around in that site of empathetic collision. Now, for this last slide, I do have a section written on how I think through these characteristics of metal, it could contribute to like wider discourse in art about sex and gender in the body. But over this weekend and being involved in these other talks about death and memorial, I thought it might be more relevant to talk more about how I think this relates to how we handle the body as matter after life, and particularly in reliquaries and the way that we shroud and present and work with the body at that moment between life and death when a person transitions into being matter. So this is a little bit more noted, so bear with me if it's not quite so clear, but these, I think this maybe this is a connection that could be made here that some of you might be interested in carrying on with. So reliquaries and coffins, where we have this physical part of a human body held within them, they tend to be layered. It's like a shroud, then a coffin, then a sarcophagus, boxes and boxes within each other. And in reliquaries in particular, in the Middle Ages, that was an active, deliberate practice of trying to put as many different layers between that physical part of the body and the people viewing it as possible. In Buddhist practices around reliquaries, that comes to the extent of there being a relic inside a box, inside a box, inside a box, inside a room, inside a building. There's all these huge, expansive layers and layers and layers of reliquaries. So this layering has two reasons behind it and two effects. The first is to shroud the body or relic from view. So it protects the relic from us viewers looking at it, touching it. The pilgrims can't get their grubby hands on your precious holy object. It's equally supposed to protect us from that power of the relic as an object that has a direct connection to heaven, a direct connection to the saint that it came from. We shouldn't be given that direct view into it. It's too powerful for us. The other reason for this layering is to amplify the body or relic, however. So every layer that you add adds a layer of meaning, of narrative, of practice, or of jewels and precious materials that give that body more power, more value. So you have these two kind of contradictory reasons behind this layering. They simultaneously obscure and reveal that material substance, that physical part of the human body, and the power and the presence that it holds. So I think this is the same effect again that I've been talking about in the body and in the metal. I think you can see these same kind of poetic connections between them. There are these layers and layers that are all made up of matter, of trying to find the core substance of what it is to be a person, or of watching that scale flake away from metal. there's this stripping back and losing material with this idea that while trying to uncover the real power of a thing, or this body part underneath, you're at the same time stripping it of that power. You have to be able to access something as material, but also as presence at the same time, and doing either without the other leads to its destruction. And I think the reason this happens more in reliquaries than it does in kind of whole body burials is that it seems to be the fragmentation of the body or the material that makes it particularly available and susceptible to the world around it and to take on those additional layers of meaning. So in Catholicism, you have the miracle of the Eucharist. You have these food and wine that you take on, and in that system of beliefs literally becomes flesh in the mouth. It has this literal transition between body and material and back again. Buddhism is similar. A lot of the most famous and most powerful Buddhist relics are made of jade, and they're not fake relics. Everyone knows they're made of jade, but in that belief system, there's an idea that when you reach enlightenment, you transcend the physical human body. And so there's a belief that Buddha inhabits all material to the same level and in the exact same way he would inhabit his own body when he was alive. So again, at this moment of death and at this moment of holding and celebrating these body parts, you have this very core belief in that transition back and forth between material and body. And if you were following or agreeing of any of that connection I was trying to make between material and the body, particularly through metal, I think that's why it would be worthwhile to explore these ideas and explore these memorial practices and these ways of seeing the body through that material in particular. So there's this idea that death or bodily deconstruction could be that transition between body and material, and that's the point at which it has this it becomes active matter. There's the body becoming matter, matter becoming body, and also the memory or the narrative of a person becoming physical through a grave marker. They're all at these kind of transitionary, moving through boundary points when that body becomes material, that material becomes active, and you have these kind of sites of interaction. So I want to close with a couple of quotes from some pieces of writing about relics and about relic culture and reliquaries that I think hopefully you'll see are using the same language and expressing some of the same ideas as everything else I've been talking about. And I know that a lot of the connections that I'm making are quite complex or vague or not necessarily easily understood through words, but hopefully if you start to see these same little flashes of characteristic appearing in these three sites, you'll be able to, it will sit in your brains for a few days and start to make other connections that might be a springboard for some more ideas. So the first quote is from Cynthia Hahn's, the introduction to Cynthia Hahn's The Reliquary Effect, which if any of you guys are interested in relics or reliquaries, I think is an incredible text. There's a copy of it in the College Road Library at Hereford. But if anyone else is interested, come and speak to me and I'll give you the ISBN number to look for one. But anyway, in the introduction, she says, although stubbornly material, they do not moulder and decay, but are able to act and operate in the world. Despite their broken and fragmentary nature, they adeptly seize the audience's imagination and propel it on a trajectory that leads to distant destinations from here and now and there and then. So the other quote I want to read is from an essay by Helen Hill called Beyond Mere Containment. And that's also a really good reference to have a look at if you're interested in these kind of metal and the way that we look at it in relation to the containment and the holding of bodily remains. Because there's a section in there about how the thickness of different metal gates at the doors to crypts and mausoleums change the kind of bodily experience of that transition between the outside world of life and the kind of inner world of death in the mausoleum. But she says that relics are never housed and never contained. Instead, they are always excessive, overflowing and spilling out, which is the exact same language that Lauren Elkin talks about when she's searching for a better understanding of the body, and the exact same language that Gilles Deleuze talks about when he's looking for this unruly presence inside the form, and the exact same language that we talk about when we use when we talk about this immanence, this presence, and this overspilling of itself that metal has when it's hot. So hopefully that's given you an idea of what metal might do in these spaces that other materials can't. And I'd be very happy to take any questions. I'll also take questions later in the sauna if you guys are tired.
No, thank you for a very interesting presentation. Super fascinating. I'm not sure though that I understood fully this Deleuze thing, or perhaps it was the Lessing thing. But how is in a way, I guess the question in the end is like how is the metal feeling something? But at the first stage, it would be: is this animism? Is this symbolism? Is this some sort of representation? Because you keep saying that it is there in the metal. The metal feels this. The metal has those characteristics. How does it have it, or how can you access that? I mean, by fortune, of course, but
yeah, of course. So very, very simply, what I mean, I don't mean a kind of that metal has a soul necessarily, though you could certainly argue that it does. What I'm thinking about is the difference between clay and metal, for example. You can squash both of them, but metal has a resistance there as well. Or when you're raising something, it has this tension that kind of moves and dissipates across its surface. So what I mean when I say metal feels the way a person does, I don't mean it experiences emotions, or that if you hit metal it feels pain. I mean that these sensations or these forces that we push into it kind of ripple across the material and have a kind of resistance and response that's similar to, or more similar to, a body than something that's less active in that interaction. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, it's I guess you said it already, but I'm not sure. Clay, for example, does not respond. It also has tensions to it and resistance, just other tensions.
I suppose you're right. I think I guess the reason I didn't stand up here and just say that straight away is that I think there's these other things. There's this kind of immanence to it. Again, it's the same thing that I feel like I can't quite express as kind of neatly as that, but it's just the idea that there is some kind of presence in the human figure, in human matter, and there is some kind of presence in metal that I think working with it, you feel, you observe. And I'm not necessarily saying that they're one and the same, but the fact that we feel these two immanences there means something, or is a kind of connection that we can play in. Yeah, I think it starts from that observation of that connection, and then trying to explain that in words is the hard thing because it exists in the material, not in the words. Yeah. But again, maybe the reason some people work in clay is because they feel that immanence there more so than they see in metal. But for me, and I think for a lot of you guys as metalsmiths or metal adjacent workers, probably have that same kind of draw to it. Yeah. Any other questions? No, good.
I could have another question if no one else have a question.
If you like, yeah.
Yes. I'm thinking about this immanence, but especially the proxy. We talk about the proxy that you use it as a proxy to see something. And I guess metal is, I mean, it's alloyed, but it's more or less very few different sorts of atoms in it. I guess we are too, but what I'm trying to say is that the human body has a complexity of different sort of function, different sorts of stuff. And metal has, in a sense, only one characteristic. Is that what you mean when you say proxy, that it is simpler?
No, when I say proxy, I think to be fair, that's missing a little bit of context from my research, because trying to fit it into a presentation is difficult. So Judith Butler talks about the idea of a proxy or a parody of the body or of gender or of sex, and as being these things that not only represent but kind of reflect and push back on the original in a way that allows us to deconstruct it. So I think that metal, not because it's like a direct mirror or an exact reproduction of the body, but it acts as a proxy or a parody of the body in a way that lets us reconsider the way we think of the body.
So what is, I mean, this deconstruction of the body, with the risk of sounding impolite, it's not my intention though, but what's the point of deconstructing that?
Well, I mean, it depends on what what theory you're deconstructing it with. So again, if you're talking about sex and gender, for example, there's the idea that deconstructing the body as we understand it allows you to then deconstruct the roles that we put people into in society, or that if we deconstruct the way that we see ourselves as people, we might be able to treat the planet better. It's this idea that if there is an issue with the way that we exist, or something that's not going right about the way we conceptualize ourselves as people, then maybe deconstruction works. And what I'm kind of getting at in that is that just deconstructing down to nothing doesn't do anything. It just leaves you with nothing. And that's something that people like Judith Butler pick up on as well, that you need there to be this kind of context that you're deconstructing within, or material that you're deconstructing towards, in order to make that worthwhile. So it's this kind of deconstruction without total obliteration, if that answered your question at all.
Yeah, but I guess it also raises the question of ethics, when it so clearly has a towards, that you said here.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I think by the towards, do you mean this kind of reconceptualization of the body, something like that?
I think, at least if I understood you, that you said that it has to have a direction, being on the way towards something.
Yeah.
And you just kind of choose that, or just arbitrarily?
Yeah, okay. Maybe that's me choosing my words wrong, because I think that what I'm trying to say is trying to have that deconstruction, have that sight to play with the body as matter before the moving towards. You know, when I say it's there's this kind of idea at the moment about deconstruction and then reconstruction, that somewhere in that middle point, it's a bit more nuanced and a bit more able to mess around. And it's in that kind of transition point between life and death, body and material. So that's probably a bad choice of words on my part.
No, but I think it's great.
Yeah.
That's so sharp.
All right, thank you. Did you have a question as well?
Not so much a question. I'm just new to blacksmithing. I've only been doing it a few months, and I completely understood what you were saying. There's something, I don't know what it is, and I just think continue what you're doing and investigating this, because that was
that was I did a 4-hour blacksmithing taste today, and so on the back of that, decided to stake my degree on it because you just hit the metal and it does something. And you think, okay, let's see what this does.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Hi.
May I ask a very personal, pragmatic question?
I suppose, but I might refuse to answer it. Yeah.
It's always a choice. This was a beautiful presentation. Thank you. Where would you like to take this as a maker and an artist and not as a researcher?
Yeah, of course. I think that's the I think you'll notice I didn't refer to any of the pictures that I had on there. They were just kind of there in the background.
I understood which was yours, I think.
Yeah, anything that wasn't cited was mine. But yeah, the reason that I did that, and I wanted, because I could have just stood here and read that, and the pictures weren't just to keep you all concentrating. I think that, yeah, as well as all of this talking, there's just these fleshy forms, and that does something that the speaking doesn't. And I like to so the work I'm doing at the moment is work like this, which I have quite a lot of control over, and I'm trying to get back to work like these, which were the first things I ever raised, and moving more into this, that form, that shape. Yeah, that releasing some control into the metal. Does that answer your question?
Definitely.
I was hoping to answer it with pictures instead of words, because that's, I feel like, where you're coming from. Yeah.
One more.
Mm-hmm.
Are they potential reliquaries?
See, I have thought about that. I think great slide to ask that question on, because this is the piece that I was thinking the most about reliquaries during. So I think that was at the reliquaries kind of there from ages and ages ago. I'd written this completely random essay on them in second year that I'd forgotten about, but I was really interested in this idea that you had this object at the center of a reliquary that was very literally physically human. It's an actual body part, an actual person. But when you shroud it in all of these layers, it does something else, and it interacts somehow with those layers and with the outside world. So rather than making the reliquary, I think I'm quite interested in the idea of making the relic, and that kind of like that thing that has this movement in the world and can perform miracles or can take on the narrative of the face that's put onto it. So, for example, that the reliquary that I wrote about in second year was a reliquary to St. Faith in Conk. And St. Faith was a martyred 12-year-old girl, but the reliquary that contains some of her bones has the head of Charlemagne. Because in medieval thinking, if you put the head of Charlemagne on something, it has the power of Charlemagne. And so it shows that this saint was the head of the church. It was the saint king, just like Charlemagne. And so, but it's still part of a teenage girl. And so it is physical human matter, but suddenly it can transform. And there's also something about that, like Schrodinger's cat, where you have something inside all of these layers that's multiple things all at once. So yeah, I like the idea of making that object that can change and that's available, but it's still physical. Yeah.
Thank you.